There is a brick in the Penn Museum, Philadelphia, that has writing on all 6 faces. You would not know this by looking at it. It sits low and dense, and the colour of dry earth, and it weighs more than it seems it should, and most of the people who walk past it on any given day have no idea that the writing pressed into its surface was placed there by a king who believed those words were load-bearing in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. The words on that brick say something very specific. They say, "This temple was built for the moon, not for the glory of the moon, not in honour of the moon, for the moon." The Sumerian construction means something closer to belonging this building, these baked walls, this enormous step platform rising above the floodplain. It is property. It is a residence. The moon lives here, and this brick, with its 6 inscribed faces, is not decoration. It is a deed. It is the document that makes the agreement between this structure and the god who occupies it legally permanent, pressed into the material body of the wall itself, buried inside the foundation, so that the agreement persists even when no one is watching. This practice had a name: foundation deposits. And the people who built the ancient city of Ur, a city that has been dead for more than 2,000 years, a city that sat on the edge of what is now southeastern Iraq, a city so old that the civilization that built it is routinely described as the origin of civilization itself, practiced this with extraordinary thoroughness. When Leonard Woolley arrived at the site in 1922, digging his way through more than 4,000 years of accumulated sediment and collapse, he found them everywhere: clay cylinders, mud bricks with royal inscriptions, small tablets pressed with cuneiform, foundation figurines, all of them buried inside the walls or beneath the thresholds of the major structures at Ur. All of them saying the same essential thing: this place was made for something. This place was made for someone. This is the proof. The inscriptions Woolley found and extracted, many of which now sit in the Penn Museum and the British Museum, catalogued under the early excavation records of the Royal Cemetery and the Ziggurat complex, are explicit about who this city belonged to. City after city, temple after temple, the inscriptions say the same name: Nana, or in the Akkadian form of the same deity's name, Suen, or the later Babylonian form, Sin. The moon god, not a moon god, not one lunar deity among many, the way we might think of a minor divinity attached to a seasonal festival. The moon god, the presiding divine power of the city of Ur, the tutelary deity, the one whose name is written on the bricks that hold the walls up, the one whose residence, whose actual palace on earth, is the great ziggurat, the enormous step structure that Unamu built around 2100 BC and that still stands, ruined but recognizable, in the Iraqi desert today. Before we go any further, take a second, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And what's been on your mind here is a detail about that ziggurat that most treatments of this subject pass over. Woolley found the foundation deposits at the corners of the ziggurat in excellent condition. The baked clay cylinders were precisely placed, one at each corner, just below the level of the earliest construction phase. The cylinders carry the name of Ur-Nammu and specify that this structure was raised for Nana, Lord of Ur. This is foundational. What it means is that the person who built the ziggurat, the king, understood himself to be constructing a permanent legal document, not just a building, a document made of building, a deposit made of an entire city's worth of baked clay. The ancient Mesopotamians pressed meaning into matter. They believed, and the texts that survive make this explicit that writing something down and sealing it inside a wall was one of the most powerful acts a human being could perform. More powerful than saying a thing, more powerful than singing it, more enduring than teaching it. When you wanted something to outlast you, when you wanted something to persist into what the text consistently called distant days, you pressed it into clay and you buried it. Before anything else in this documentary arrives before the boat that no goddess can stop, before the deed that was never written, before the city that was calibrated to the moon's most extreme positions in the sky, before the man who walked the Arabian desert for 10 years at the command of a god whose temple was in ruins, you need to hold this in your mind. The brick, the 6 inscribed faces, the legal permanence of what is pressed into clay and buried in the wall, the ancient understanding that what is written and deposited is what survives into distant days, because everything that follows is about the one exception, and this is where the story begins. Not with what was deposited, with what was deliberately, specifically and formally described as having never been deposited at all. In 556 BC, a man named Nabonidus became king of Babylon. He was not the obvious choice. His predecessor Neriglissar had died and left a young son, Labashi-Marduk, who lasted perhaps 9 months before a palace coup removed him. Nabonidus came to power under circumstances that the ancient sources treat with some delicacy, and he spent much of the rest of his life arguing, in writing, that his kingship was legitimate not because of bloodlines, but because of a dream, a specific dream, from a specific deity. The moon god came to him at night. This is not a metaphor in the way we might use the word. The Harran Stela, a large basalt inscription that Nabonidus commissioned for the Temple of Sin at Harran in modern southern Turkey, records the content of the dream directly. The translation, prepared by Frauke Weierhuser and Jamie Novotny for the Munich Open Access Cuneiform Corpus Initiative, based on the original Akkadian text, opens with a passage that scholars have spent decades trying to fully interpret. Here is what it says. The great deed of the god Sni, which none of the gods and goddess knew, which since distant days had not descended from heaven into the land, and which the people of the land had not seen, written down on a clay tablet, nor deposited for eternity you. The god Sni, lord of the gods and goddesses who reside in heaven, have come down from heaven in the time of Nabonidus, king of Babylon. Read that again slowly. The great deed of sin, which none of the gods knew, which had not descended into the land since distant days, which the people of the land had not seen, not written down on a clay tablet, not deposited for eternity. This is a cuneiform inscription. This is a text produced by a civilization that organized the entire project of civilization itself around the practice of writing things down on clay tablets and depositing them for eternity. And it opens by describing a deed so enormous, so long withheld, that it had never been written, never been deposited. The document you are listening to right now is a man who lived in 556 BC depositing a description of a thing that was never deposited. He is the first person to commit this to clay, and we do not know what the deed was. That is not quite accurate. We know what Nabonidus says the deed was. He says Sin sent him a dream telling him to rebuild the temple at Harran. He says the moon god chose him as king. He says the deed was this revelation, this descent from heaven, this choosing of an unlikely man to receive a divine mandate. But scholars who have worked closely with this text, Paul Alain Beaulieu, whose work on Nabonidus's political theology is foundational to any serious reading of these inscriptions, and Hanspeter Schaudig, whose comprehensive edition of the Nabonidus inscriptions is the standard reference, have noted something that a straightforward reading misses. The opening of the Haran Stela is not structured like a record of what happened. It is structured like the announcement of something that was withheld, not the announcement of what is happening now, the announcement that a concealment has ended. Something that was kept from the gods, from the people, from the clay, has now been brought down. And the text does not fully name it. It names its recipient. It names its form. It describes 5 qualities: unknown, undescended, unseen, unwritten, undeposited, and it identifies when it arrived, in the time of Nabonidus. What sin held back from the gods, from the land, from the tablets? For all the time before this moment, the Haran Stela points at it without quite touching it. That pointing is what this documentary is about. The city of was built on a point of land between 2 bodies of water. To the east was the Euphrates. To the west, a large lake, or depending on the season, a shallow sea that connected to a coastal lagoon. When Unamu raised the ziggurat around 2100 BCE, the city was effectively an island, or something close to one. The maps that archaeologists have reconstructed from the survey data show a roughly oval urban area surrounded on multiple sides by water, sitting at the head of the Persian Gulf's ancient coastline. This matters because of what the city was doing with all that water. Was a port, one of the most significant ports in the ancient world, at certain periods the wealthiest city on earth, a hub connecting the trade routes of the Gulf with the river systems of Mesopotamia. The city's wealth ran through its quays, the landing docks, where the great canal boats would come in from the river, offload their goods, and transfer them into the temple's administrative system. And in the primary texts about the moon god Nana, one object appears repeatedly, with a regularity that popular treatments of this subject almost completely ignore. A boat, a specific boat, not just any boat, the moon god's boat, a ceremonial barge described in the hymn texts with considerable specificity. In Hymn E, the text now catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ETCSL 4.1305, the moon god is described as occupying a lapis lazuli quay, a landing place made of the brilliant blue stone that the ancient Mesopotamians valued above all other materials, the stone they quarried from what is now Afghanistan and traded across the entire width of the ancient world. The stone that appears in the royal graves at in such quantities that it still astonishes archaeologists who work with the collections. The passage from Hymn E runs as follows: with the majestic oil of the sacred body, the oil of lordship, oil from your great treasury, Lord Ningublaga consecrates the hands on his lapis lazuli quay, the majestic quay, the sacred quay. Lapis lazuli was the colour of the night sky. The deep saturated blue of it, flecked with gold, was to the ancient Mesopotamians the visual representation of heaven itself. When they wanted to describe something as celestial, as belonging to the upper registers of the universe, to the realm above the clouds, they reached for lapis lazuli. The quay on which the moon god's hands are consecrated is not blue for decorative reasons. It is blue because it is a place where the terrestrial and the celestial meet, where the boat from above docks on the ground below. Hold that distinction carefully. When the moon god's boat is described in the primary texts, it is not metaphorical in the way a modern reader might assume. The ancient Sumerian religious imagination was strongly material. The gods were real presences whose physical movements through the cosmos had real physical effects on the world. When Nana sailed, crops grew. When Nana moved through the sky, the tides shifted, the calendar advanced, the floods came or receded. The boat was not a symbol of the moon's movement. The boat was the mechanism. The boat is how the moon god moved the world. And the moon god built a specific boat for a specific journey. The text that describes this in most detail is the journey of Nana to Nippur, catalogued as ETCSL 1.5.1. It is one of the most structurally unusual compositions in the entire corpus of Sumerian literature. It begins with the moon god deciding, apparently on his own initiative, to travel to Nippur, the sacred city of his father Enlil, the city that was the religious centre of the entire Sumerian world, the city whose authority over all other cities was the foundational geopolitical reality of the ancient Near East. But first, he has to build a boat. What follows in the text is one of the longest material inventories in Sumerian literature. Nana dispatches agents across the known world to gather the components, reeds from Tumal, pitch from the Abzu, rushes from Duasaga, strakes from the cypress forests, ribbing from the forests of Kugnunar, beams from the mountain of fragrant cedar, planking from the forests of Ebla, fir wood from the fragrant cedar forest. Read this list carefully. It is not a list of local materials. Cedar forests are not in southern Iraq. Ebla is in Syria. The mountain of fragrant cedar points toward Lebanon or the Zagros. The moon god's boat is assembled from materials gathered across the entirety of the ancient world. It is a vehicle whose construction required the mobilization of resources from every direction on the compass. It is not a local boat. It is not a regional boat. It is cosmological, and when it is finished, Nana sets out on his journey. He travels from northward along the river toward Nippur, and along the way something happens that the text returns to again and again with the hypnotic insistence that characterizes the best Sumerian poetry. He passes through cities, one after another, and at each city the goddess of that city comes out to meet the boat. She comes out with offerings. She comes out with flour and bran and a covered bronze vessel. She calls out, "Welcome, welcome, welcome, O boat of Suen, welcome, welcome, O boat." And then she makes her offer. She offers oil rubbed on its peg, ghee and syrup and wine, the carp to rejoice at the prow. She asks the boat to stop, to unload, to stay, and every time the answer is the same. But the boat did not give her its cargo. I am going to Nibru, 5 cities, 5 goddesses, the goddess of Enagir, the goddess of Lhasa, the goddess of Uruk, who is holy Inanna herself, daughter of Nana, who calls out to her father's boat and still cannot stop it, the goddess of Shuruppak, the goddess of Tumal, who is Ninlil, Nana's own mother, who calls out to him and still the answer comes back. I am going to Nibru, the first refusal. I am going to Nibru, the second. I am going to Nibru. 3 times now. No matter who asks, I am going to Nibru. Even his own daughter standing in the water with her arms out. I am going to Nibru. 5 goddesses. 5 times the same answer. No matter who asks. No matter what is offered. No matter how beautiful the quay, how rich the gifts, how beloved the goddess who is standing in the water with flour on her hands. The boat does not give her its cargo. It keeps moving. This refusal 5 times repeated, almost verbatim, as if the text is grinding the reader's expectations down with deliberate repetition, is one of the most unusual structural features in Sumerian literature. The scholars who edited and translated this text do not attempt to fully resolve its meaning. What they note is the formulaic quality of the refusals. Each city gets exactly the same greeting and exactly the same answer, with no variation in the boat's response regardless of the seniority of the goddess who is asking. Even Inanna cannot stop the boat. Even Ninlil cannot stop the boat. The cargo is going to Nippur. And the text does not fully describe what the cargo is. We know what it contains in physical terms. The lists are detailed. Cattle by the hundreds, carefully enumerated, birds from specific ponds, fish of named varieties, eggs in baskets, new reed and old reed, all the biological richness of the Sumerian alluvial plain collected into this extraordinary vessel and transported northward. But the text opens with a declaration that will sit in the room for the rest of this documentary. Before Nanna builds the boat, before he dispatches his agents to the cedar forests and the pitch lakes and the cypress groves, he speaks. He announces his intention. And his announcement begins with a line that has no parallel in any other Sumerian text that scholars have so far identified. Before Dilmun existed, palm trees grew in my city. Dilmun is the Sumerian name for a paradisiacal land. To the east, scholars have identified it variously with Bahrain, the eastern coast of Arabia, or some combination of both. It appears in Sumerian texts as the primordial clean land, the land before death, the place where the sun rises and the first water comes from. When Sumerian texts want to say something happened at the very beginning of time, before civilization and before memory, they invoke Dilmun. And Nanna says, before that, before the beginning of civilization, as Sumerians understood it, before the land, before death, in a time before anyone currently alive could conceive of or remember. Palm trees grew in my city. This is not nostalgia. This is a cosmological claim. Nanna is announcing that his city Nippur, his father's city, the destination of the journey, is older than the oldest thing anyone knows. His city is older than Dilmun. His city is older than paradise itself. And he is going to bring it something. Something that 5 goddesses, including his own daughter, including his own mother, could not convince him to leave behind. There is a Sumerian word that does not translate well. The word is me. It is pronounced as a single syllable roughly like May, and it appears across hundreds of cuneiform tablets spanning more than 2,000 years of Mesopotamian writing, and scholars continue to debate exactly what it means. Picture a clay tablet held flat in both hands. Feel the weight of it more than you expect, dense and cool, the surface still slightly soft near the edges where the stylus pressed deepest. Whatever the scribe wrote on this surface was not simply recorded. It was fixed. It was given the kind of permanence that a spoken word cannot have, that a memory cannot have, that intention alone cannot have. What the scribe pressed into clay became part of the category of things that persist. The closest English approximation for me is usually divine powers, but this is inadequate. The me are not powers in the sense of abilities or capabilities that a god possesses. They are something closer to preconditions. They are the set of abstract and concrete principles without which a particular feature of civilization cannot exist at all. Not the exercise of kingship, but kingship itself. Not the act of writing, but the capacity for writing to exist. Not the ceremony of descent into the underworld, but the metaphysical structure that makes such a descent possible. A famous myth, one of the most studied texts in Sumerian literature, describes how the me were distributed. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, held the me in his great storeroom, beneath the primordial ocean. Inanna, his granddaughter, came to visit and got him drunk and persuaded him to give her the me, and she loaded them onto her boat and carried them back to Uruk, her city. And when Enki sobered up and sent his messengers to retrieve them, it was too late. Inanna already had them. Civilization was now hers to distribute. The list of what Inanna carries away in the boat is remarkable for its combination of the sublime and the mundane. Kingship, the priestly office, descent to the underworld and ascent from it, the art of the scribe, woodworking, the craft of the smith, the art of the fuller, the art of the leather worker, music, wailing, the black-headed people, eunuchs, prostitutes, the standard and the quiver, the wiles of women, truth, the descent into the underworld, the ascent from the underworld. What matters about this list is not its length. What matters is that writing is on it, not symbolic writing, not a general idea of written communication. The scribal art, the specific technology of pressing meaning into clay with a reed stylus, is one of the me, one of the preconditions without which civilization cannot function. It sits on the list with kingship and prostitution and descending to the underworld, not because it is comparable in scale to those things, but because it is comparable in kind. Writing is one of the categories of being without which the world that the Sumerians knew would be a fundamentally different kind of world. Now turn to Him-E TCSL 4.1305, lines 20 through 26. O Nannar, he has chosen as your inheritance that you should surpass the Anunnaki gods. He has seated you in a sacred dwelling amid their pure divine powers which gladden the heart. He has grandly called the great gods to the food offerings. He has seated them for the ritual which fills the heart with majestic pleasure. He has presented to the gods their offerings which gladden the heart. He has seated you in a majestic place, a sacred place, the Anunnaki gods, the assembly, the group of high divine beings who in Sumerian theology were collectively responsible for decreeing fates, and Nanna is told, you will surpass them. You are seated among their divine powers. The me of the assembly, the preconditions for divine authority Nanna, is placed inside them. He does not merely receive divine powers, he is seated within the divine powers. He inhabits the me. The difference between possessing a divine power and being seated within it is the difference between using a tool and being part of the tool's nature. An ordinary deity can possess the me of kingship, can exercise royal authority. But to be seated within the me is to be constitutive of the condition itself. It means the condition requires your presence. The moon does not merely hold authority over the passage of time, over the tides, over the calendar, over the monthly rhythms of fertility and flood. The moon is what makes those things possible as categories of experience. Remove the moon from the divine assembly and the me themselves are diminished. This is the cosmological position of Nanna as described in the Him-E text, and it creates a specific problem for reading the Haran Stela. If the moon god is seated within the divine powers, if he is constitutive of the condition of writing, of scribal art, of all the preconditions for civilization that the me represent, then the opening of the Haran Stela is not merely unusual, it is structurally paradoxical. The deity who is seated within the me of scribal art has a deed that was never written on a clay tablet. The deity who is constitutively related to the capacity for meaning to be pressed into matter has withheld something from that process. For how long, the text says, since distant days, since the beginning, since before this moment. In all the time that writing has existed as a category of human experience, This deed has stood outside the clay. This is not an accident of history. This is not simply because no one got around to writing it down. The text is explicit. It was deliberately not deposited. The not writing is as intentional as the writing of every foundation brick that Unamu pressed into the corners of his ziggurat. The absence from the record is as deliberate as the presence of all those inscribed cylinders that Woolley found buried in the foundation courses. To understand what was being withheld, you have to understand what was being kept. And to understand what was being kept, you have to understand the architecture of the city that housed the moon. In 2019, a researcher named William Romaine published a paper in the Journal of Skyscape Archaeology, Volume 5, Number 2, titled Lunar Alignments at Entanglements with the Moon God Nana. Romaine is an archaeoastronomer, a scholar who studies the relationship between ancient built environments and astronomical phenomena. His methodology in this paper is careful. He works from Woolley's original excavation plans, cross-checked against 1927 and 1930 Royal Air Force aerial photographs of the site photographs taken before the site was further disturbed, correcting for the fact that Woolley's north arrows were slightly off from true north, approximately 2.5 to 3 degrees wrong, due to a double application of the magnetic declination correction that was standard practice at the time. When Romaine recalculates the actual orientations of the major structures at the ziggurat, the Etameneger enclosure that surrounded it, the Giparu, which was the residence of the high priestess of Nana, the court of Nana, and the royal Ekersag palace to the southeast, he finds something that Woolley's plans, with their slightly skewed north arrows, had obscured. The major axis of the line that runs through the city's central architectural spine, aligns with an azimuth of 326 degrees, almost exactly northwest. The moon's maximum northward rise for 2000 BC, corrected for horizon altitude, atmospheric refraction, and lunar parallax falls at approximately 56 degrees, almost exactly northeast. 326 and 56 are not the same number, but they are something more interesting than the same number. They are orthogonal. They are perpendicular. The city's spine runs at a right angle to the moonrise at the northern standstill. This is not an accident. Romaine notes that the Etameneger, the great sacred enclosure around the ziggurat, shares the same axis. The Giparu shares it. The court of Nana shares it. The stairway of the ziggurat itself, in an independent measurement by Davide Nadali and Andrea Porcaro published in 2016, aligns to 56 degrees directly toward the moon's maximum north rise point on the horizon, and the Ekersag, the royal palace to the southeast, is oriented differently. Its primary facade faces the lunar south, set the point on the horizon where the moon, at its maximum southern standstill, disappears below the horizon. The city is not merely built near the moon god's temple. The city is a physical instrument calibrated to the moon's most extreme positions in the sky. The ziggurat looks toward where the moon rises at its furthest point north. The palace faces where the moon disappears at its furthest point south. Think about what this means in human terms. The people who built were operating with a long-term understanding of the moon's cycle that most modern people cannot easily conceptualize. The moon does not rise and set at the same point on the horizon every night. It drifts. Over the course of approximately 27 days, it traces a complete cycle, rising further north, then further south, then north again. But there is a longer cycle underneath that. Approximately every 18.6 years, the moon's path reaches its maximum extent its extreme northernmost rise and extreme southernmost set. This is the lunar major standstill. And then the moon gradually contracts back toward the centre, and 9.3 years later it reaches its minor standstill, its closest possible approach to the celestial equator, before expanding again toward the major. 18.5 years. Nearly 2 decades between one lunar major standstill and the next. The builders of Ur encoded this cycle into the physical orientation of their city. They were not watching the moon from night to night, the way we might glance up at the sky and notice whether it is full or new or cresting. They were watching the moon across decades, across generations. Someone began noting the position of the maximum north rise when they were a child, and they recorded it. And they passed that record to the next person, and that person added to it, and the measurement of the cycle required a commitment to observation and recording that spanned multiple human lifetimes. This is what it means to say the city was an instrument, not a metaphor for attentiveness, an actual instrument built to a specification that required generational patience to calibrate a patience that a single human life is not long enough to complete alone, and it connects directly to the texts. Romain notes that the journey of Nana to Nippur, the text examined in the previous chapter, with its 5-city route and its cargo that no goddess could stop, appears to encode the lunar calendar within its geography. The distance from Ur to Nippur is approximately 154 kilometres. The azimuth from Ur to Nippur is 327.4 degrees. This is within 1.4 degrees of the major axis of the city of Ur itself. The journey is not merely a mythological narrative about the moon god visiting his father. The journey traces the city's own alignment, projected outward across the landscape. When Nana's boat carries its cargo past Enegir, past Lhasa, past Uruk, past Shuruppak, past Tumal, refusing each city's goddess and pressing on to Nippur, it is not simply asserting the authority of Nippur over the smaller cities. It is tracing a line that runs from the city of the moon to the city of the highest god, a line that corresponds within 2 degrees to the orientation of every major building in Ur's sacred precinct. The city is the text is the city, and inside that city, inside those walls, inside the foundation bricks of the ziggurat that look toward the moon's maximum rise point and the palace that faces the point where the moon disappears, is everything the moon god is. Now return to Himi lines 27 through 30. Enki purifies the dwelling for you, he makes the dwelling shine for you. He consecrates the heavens for you, he makes the earth shine for you. He makes the Kish Nugau, the house of the cedar forests, tower straight upward for you. He makes your majestic residence into a sacred place for you, the foundation of heaven and earth. The foundation of heaven and earth, not just a temple at Ur, the foundation of heaven and earth. And then lines 49 through 55, the lapis lazuli quay passage the blue landing place, the celestial quay where the moon god's boat docks, and where his hands are anointed with oil before he places them on the offering table with the majestic oil of the sacred body, the oil of lordship. Oil from your great treasury, Lord Ningoblaga consecrates the hands on his lapis lazuli quay, the majestic quay, the sacred quay. The quay is not just a landing place, it is the anointing place, the place where the hands that determine fates, that decree destinies, that hold the me of the divine assembly, are consecrated. The place where the moon god is prepared for his role as the most senior member of the assembly that governs the world, and the entire city is oriented toward this place. The city is a machine for locating this place, the place where the moon touches Earth, relative to the actual positions of the moon at its most extreme points in the sky. The city is a record of an observation that took decades to complete, and the record is not written on clay. The record is the city. Go back to the Haran Stella, not the opening. Move past the opening. You have heard the opening. Let it sit there in the room, unresolved, while you go further into the text. Column 2, lines 40 through 42. The translation by Wayashauser and Novotny renders these lines as follows. The gods were quivering like reed decilum, the Anunnaki gods, who in front of the command Silum of his great divinity, which cannot be changed, were trembling. The Anunnaki. The assembly. The council of great gods, the same assembly before, whom Ningal had prostrated herself in the lament for pleading for her city, begging that not be destroyed. The assembly before, whose decrees even the queen of the moon god trembled and wept. The assembly of which, in Himmi, Nana has been told he will surpass. They are trembling at the command of Sin. Let that settle before moving forward. The highest governing body in the Sumerian theological universe, the council of divine beings, who decree the fates of cities and kings, who voted to destroy and could not be moved by a mother's weeping, who set the entire structure of the world in motion with their word, is trembling. Like reeds, the text reaches for a specific image, reeds in wind. The familiar sound and motion of the marshes around the thing that everyone who lived in that city heard every day, the sound of something tall and green and absolutely flexible bending to a force it cannot resist. The assembly bends before Sin's command. Now read what immediately precedes this in the text. Column the 2nd, lines 32 through 39. The passage describes Sin's authority in a sequence that escalates with each clause. The one who has gathered all of the divine offices of highest rank, the one who has collected all of the divine offices of supreme power, the one who has taken all of the divine offices of the role of the god Ea, who grasps in his hands the totality of all of the divine offices of heaven. The Enlil of the gods, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, the Enlil of the gods. This is not a small title. Enlil is the king of the Sumerian pantheon, not the creator that is Enki's domain, not the source of order that is the Me, distributed by Inanna. Enlil is the one who commands, the one whose word the gods cannot change, cannot circumvent, cannot negotiate around. When Ningal weeps and begs for not to be destroyed, what she is begging An and Enlil to reconsider is an Enlil decree. And the text records clearly that An did not change his word, and Enlil did not soothe her heart. The Haran Stella assigns this authority, this specific, unappealable commanding function to Sin. Not an analogy, not a comparison. The designation itself, the Enlil function, the ultimate commanding authority of the divine world, belongs to Sin. This has profound implications for how to read the Stella's opening lines. If the moon god holds the Enlil function, if he is the ultimate authority, before whom even the divine assembly trembles like reeds, then the deed that was not written down, not deposited, not seen by the people of the land, not known by any other god. This is not some minor ritual act. This is not the kind of deed that gets written in a year name formula on a foundation brick. This is the act of the highest authority in the divine world, the thing the king of gods held back for all of distant days. There is a passage in Shulgi B, the hymn of Shulgi, The great self-praise poem of the Ur-3 king that gives another dimension of this. Shulgi ruled Ul approximately a century after Ul-Narmu, around 2094 to 2047 BCE. He was one of the most boastful kings in Mesopotamian history, and his hymns are extraordinary documents of royal self-representation. In Shulgi B, ETCSL 2.4.2, 02, he describes his relationship to Nana and to the city of Ur with a specific claim that sits beside the Harran Stela in an illuminating way. Lines 297 through 307, "But if his heart devises treason against me, and he commits violence against anything of mine, may Nana then adjudicate against this rebel, and let Utu the torch catch him, he who knows, and does not proclaim the truth about me, will be stopped by Nana's judgment. Nana adjudicates, Nana judges." This is one of the moon god's consistent functions across the primary texts. He is the judge of last resort, not in the sense of an earthly court, but in the cosmic sense. The moon god's monthly disappearance into the underworld was understood, in the cult texts, the incantation literature, the wisdom literature, as a period of judgment. For 3 days each month, the moon is dark. For 3 days, Nana is gone from the sky. And the interpretation threading through these texts is that during those 3 days, the moon is below the earth, below the world, in the realm of the dead, adjudicating, judging, reviewing the record. The moon god is the one who determines what is true and what is false in the record, and the greatest deed in the cosmic record was the one he chose not to enter into the record at all. He is the judge, and he is the one who kept something out of evidence. In the National Museum of Istanbul, there are 2 basalt stellar fragments that come from Harran. They do not belong to Nabonidus. They belong to his mother. Her name was Adad Gupi. She lived by the reckoning of her own autobiographical inscription, which is itself a remarkable document, one of the oldest first-person female autobiographies that survives from the ancient world from approximately 648 BCE to approximately 547 BCE, roughly a century, and she spent that century in devoted service to the moon god Sin. The inscription, now catalogued in the Aurak database as Ribbo/Babylon 7Q05471, begins with a declaration of identity: "I am Hadad-ap, mother of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, the one who reveres the deities Sneh, Ningal, Nusku, and Sadanuna, my gods." Adad Gupi was a devotee of Sin at Harran. Harran was one of the great cultic centres of the moon god, located in what is now southeastern Turkey, far to the north and west of Babylon. Its temple, the Ehulul, which means house of rejoicing, had been partially destroyed during the upheavals of the late Assyrian period in the series of catastrophes that ended with the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. Sin's temple was in ruins, and Adad Gupi waited. She did not leave. She did not transfer her devotion to a deity whose house was still standing, whose priests still processed at dawn, whose altars still received oil. She kept going back. She maintained the daily offerings, bread, water, sheep, the small faithful acts of cultic service that require no audience and no confirmation. She maintained them during the years when Sin's presence had become something she could not confirm except by continuing to behave as though it was still there. The inscription describes this waiting with a specific kind of restraint. It does not claim visions. It does not claim divine consolation. It describes decades of unwitnessed service, maintained by a woman who had decided that a god's absence was not the same as a god's abandonment. Think about what that decision costs. Think about keeping a lamp lit in a house whose occupant has been gone for 40 years. For 50 years, the oil, the wick, the daily return to a threshold where no one answers, the prayers offered into silence. The question you are not quite asking, because to ask it directly would require an answer, and you are not sure you are ready for the answer, so you keep asking it sideways, through the bread, through the water, through the morning offering that you bring, whether or not anything is different from yesterday. She kept the bread fresh. The gods had abandoned the city, the way Nana had abandoned Ur in the lament, and Adad Gupi was Ningal in the abandoned city, the one who refused to flee, who maintained her posture of grief and service before a deity who had gone silent, who tore at her hair and beat her chest, and kept showing up every morning regardless. And then, when she was very old, something changed. Sin spoke to her son. The dream that Nabonidus records on the Haran Stella Sin descending, Sin choosing an unlikely man who had no dynasty behind him, Sin commanding, "Build my house, and I will give you all the lands." This dream is the answer to his mother's vigil. Not a metaphorical answer, a structural one. Nabonidus becomes king because his mother held the door open for nearly a century. This matters to the structure of the stela in ways that straightforward readings of the text miss. The opening of the Haran Stela, the great deed of sin, not written, not deposited, not known by the gods or seen by the people, is not primarily a record of what happened in 556 BC when Nabonidus came to power. It is a response to a question that has been sitting in the air for nearly a century. Why did Sin leave Haran? Adad Gupi's inscription does not answer this. She does not explain why Sin withdrew. She only records that he was absent, that she served faithfully in his absence, and that after her death she dies before Nabonidus rebuilds the temple her son builds, what she spent her life waiting for. The great deed of sin was the answer to why he had been gone, and the answer is described with 5 negatives: unknown, undescended, unseen, unwritten, undeposited. Sin was absent because he was doing something. He was preparing something. He was holding something back from the record, from the gods, from the people, from the clay, in the years when his temple stood in ruins and his devotee kept showing up with bread and water and her bare faithful persistence. We do not know what he was doing. We know what the text says happened when he came back. He gave Nabonidus a dream, told him to rebuild the temple, promised him the lands. But the text opens before that. The text opens on the quality of the absence, the quality of the long withholding. Nabonidus uses a specific Akkadian word for deed in this opening, ipiu, sometimes rendered as great work or great act. Schaudig's commentary on this word, in his comprehensive edition of the Nabonidus inscriptions, notes that its use here is unusual, that it suggests not a single action, but a sustained condition, a state of preparedness, as something that was building over time, a great deed in progress, a withholding that was itself the doing of something. Adad Gupi waited 95 years. Sin was absent for 95 years, and when the answer finally came, Nabonidus spent 10 years in the desert to receive it fully. Here is what we know about those 10 years. The Haran Stela records it directly. Column I, lines 22 through 26, "Moreover he took me far away from my city Babylon, and for 10 years I walked the road between the cities Tm, Dadnu, Padakku, Ibriyadu, and as far as Yatrabu. I did not enter my city, Babylon, Tama, Dadanu, Padakku, Hebra, Yedihu, and as far as Yatrabu, which is the ancient name of what is now Medina. These are cities in the Arabian desert. Some of them have been identified by archaeologists. Inscriptions in Nabonidus' name have been found at Tamar and at the site identified with the Sailor inscription location in southern Jordan. German archaeological missions working in Saudi Arabia in the early 21st century confirmed the presence of Babylonian material culture at multiple sites along the route Nabonidus describes. He was not hiding. He was not fleeing. He was not mad, despite what later Persian propaganda and the interpretive tradition that runs from the verse account of Nabonidus through the book of Daniel and into modern popular history would suggest. He was obeying a command. He was told, "Go to the desert, walk between these cities, I will give you the lands." And for 10 years he walked. The Haran Stela describes what happened during those 10 years with considerable specificity. The gods Shamash, Ishtar, Adad, and Nergal were assigned as his guard. The people of Arabia bowed at his feet. The kings of Egypt, Media, and Arabia sent envoys to establish peace, even during the desert years away from Babylon, away from the ziggurat, away from the great archive of clay in which the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization was stored. The moon god's agenda was being enacted. Nabonidus was walking the roads between the cities of Arabia, and the moon was tracking him from above. Every city he stopped in, the moon would have been visible. Every night in the desert, the moon would have been overhead. There were no mountains high enough, no forests thick enough, no city walls tall enough to block the view of the sky from the Arabian plateau. For 10 years, every time Nabonidus needed to locate himself in space and time, he looked up. He was not building a temple during those 10 years. He was being prepared to build one, and something was being kept from the record until he came back. There is a specific kind of grief in the Lament for Ur that is unlike anything else in Sumerian literature. The Lament for Ur is an 11-section ceremonial lamentation composed around the time of the fall of Ur to the Elamites, approximately 2004 BCE. Ur-Nammu's city, the city that pointed at the moon, the city whose foundation bricks were inscribed with the moon god's name, and whose walls were oriented to the moon's most extreme rising point on the horizon. The lament opens with a roll call of abandonment. Enlil has abandoned his shrine. Ninlil has abandoned her house. Ninasina has abandoned the Igalmar. Inanna has abandoned Uruk. Nana has abandoned Ur. Suen has abandoned the Ikish-Nugal. Every major deity, every major city, every sacred house in the Sumerian world, all abandoned, all left to the breezes. The word used for the breezes, the thing that haunts the abandoned sheepfolds, is the same word used for spirit, for wind, for the quality of presence that fills a sacred space when a deity is in residence. When the deity leaves, what takes their place is not nothing. What takes their place is an echo of their presence, a draught where a body used to be. The most devastating lines in the text come when Ningal, the wife of Nana, the queen of Ur, the moon god's consort, speaks in her own voice. Truly I shed my tears before An. Truly I myself made supplication to Enlil. Let not my city be destroyed, I implored them. Let not Urim be destroyed, I implored them. Let not its people perish, I implored them. But An did not change that word. Enlil did not soothe my heart with an "it is good, so be it." She tries twice. The text is specific about this. She goes to the divine assembly a second time when the council had settled itself in the preeminent place, and the Anunna had seated themselves to ratify decisions. I prostrated myself and stretched out my arms. Truly I shed my tears before An. Truly I myself made supplication to Enlil. Let not my city be destroyed, I implored them. Twice she begs, twice they refuse. And then they gave instructions that my city should be utterly destroyed. They gave instructions that Urim should be utterly destroyed. They decreed its destiny that its people should be killed. And in the companion text, the Lament for Sumer and Urim, ECCSL 2.2.3, a single line appears that carries the weight of everything that follows. Boats and barges ceased docking at the shining quay. The lapis lazuli quay, the place where Nana's boat arrives, the place where his hands are anointed, the place described in Himi as the point of contact between the celestial and the terrestrial, where the moon god is prepared for his role as the one who surpasses the Anunnaki. When falls, the quay goes silent. No boats, no anointing, no arrival. The moon god has left the quay. Now let this sit alongside everything accumulated across this documentary. Nana's boat travels from to Nippur and carries cargo that 5 goddesses cannot divert. The cargo is going to the highest god. The cargo corresponds to a journey that encodes the alignment of the city, the moonrise at the northern standstill, the disappearance at the southern standstill, the 18.6-year cycle pressed into the foundations of every major building in the sacred precinct. The city falls, the quay goes silent, 5 centuries pass. Adad-Gupi keeps the offering bread fresh. Her son has a dream. The dream announces a deed that was not written on clay, not deposited for eternity, not known by the gods or the people, withheld across all of time from the beginning until this moment. And Nabonidus, the man the Haran Stella identifies as an only son who had no dynasty, who did not think kingship was in his heart, is sent to the desert for 10 years to prepare himself to receive it. There is something about the structure of this withholding that keeps pressing. The moon god occupies the me of the divine assembly. He is seated within the divine powers, including the divine power of writing. He is the judge who goes below for 3 dark days each month to adjudicate the record. He is the Enlil of the gods, the one whose command cannot be changed, and whose word is not spoken twice. He held something back, from the gods, from the clay, from all of them, for the full span of distant days, and when he brought it down, when he finally descended, for the first time. In the time of Nabonidus, the first thing the inscription says about it is that it was not deposited. The very first quality of the deed is its absence from the record. What does it mean to announce that something was not deposited by the god of the me that includes the act of deposit itself? The foundation bricks at say, this place is made for Nana. They say, this agreement is sealed in clay, buried in the wall, permanent across distant days. They say, what is written here has the force of divine law. The Haran Stilla opens by saying, the most important thing the moon god ever did was not in those bricks, was never in those bricks, was kept from the bricks deliberately, carefully, across the entire span of time during which the bricks have existed. The bricks at oriented toward the moonrise at the northern standstill, pointed at the place where the moon appears on the horizon at its maximum. The palace, facing the point where the moon disappears at the southern standstill, the palace faced the absence. The place where the moon is not. The city was encoding presence and absence both, the arrival and the withholding, the quay and the silence at the quay. Now consider the boat in the journey of Nana, the line that has been present since the 2nd chapter, unanswered, but the boat did not give her its cargo. 5 goddesses, 5 cities, the same response to each. The cargo is going to Nibiru. The cargo is going to the highest god. The text does not tell us what the cargo does when it gets there. Nana docks at the Shining Quay. He calls out to his father's doorkeeper, Cow, open the house. He enters the E-Kur, the great temple. Enlil rejoices over him and feeds him sweet cakes and offers him the finest beer. And then Nana asks for his blessing for the carp flood and speckled barley and old reed and long life in the palace, and Enlil gives him everything he asks for, and he turns around and goes back to Ur. The text ends there. The cargo is not described again. What Nana brought to Nibiru, what was in the prow of the boat and the stern of the boat, that the doorkeeper Kal was promised as a first offering, and a last offering. The text names the offerings, but never names the whole. There is something in the cargo that the text holds back. There is something in the boat that the text will not fully name. The boat that cannot be stopped by any goddess, not by Inanna, not by Ninlil, the boat whose cargo is going to the Father, to the highest place, to the point toward which the city of Ur has been aligned for generations, carries something that remains unnamed. And the Haran Stela, written 500 years after the journey, opens by announcing that the thing which was never written the deed, that was never deposited, has finally come down, in the time of Nabonidus. Here is the question that every scholar who has worked seriously with these texts eventually arrives at, though most arrive at it and then set it carefully to one side because it does not yield to the tools available. Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, not because he was bad at being king. The evidence of the Haran Stela and the Adad Gupi inscription and the Tamar inscriptions and the administrative records from his reign suggests that he was, in many ways, a remarkably capable ruler, a genuine antiquarian who cared about the preservation of old texts and the accuracy of historical records in a way unusual for his era. He excavated the temples of previous kings. He found a foundation inscription of Naram Sin, the great Akkadian king, and he tried to date it, and he got the date wrong by more than a millennium, but he tried. He was doing something that no one before him had systematically attempted. He was trying to read the record back, and he was governed by a god who had told him, "The most important thing I ever did was not in the record." There is a specific practice that Nabonidus used when he found an old foundation inscription. He did not simply copy it. He did not simply quote it. He wrote around it. He built his own royal inscription in layers, and somewhere in those layers he would insert what he had found, the inscription of the old king, the name of the old temple, the account of what had been built there before, and he would annotate it. He would explain what it meant. He would say, "This thing that was built before was already ancient when I found it." He would say, "This inscription I found in the ruins is 300 years old, or 500 years old, or 1,700 years old, older than anything I can calculate with the tools I have." He cared. This is the thing that the popular tradition of the mad last king, the eccentric worshipper of the wrong deity, the man who abandoned Babylon for the desert, consistently obscures. He was a man who cared about the record. He devoted significant resources and attention to excavating old temples, reading old texts, preserving old inscriptions. He was, in a meaningful sense, doing what historians and archaeologists do now, reading back into the record to find what came before, what was built, what was written, what was meant. And he was doing this while being governed by a god who told him, "The most important thing I ever did is not in the record you are reading." This is the irony that sits at the centre of the Haran Stela. The greatest antiquarian in Mesopotamian history, the man most committed to recovering what the clay had preserved, governed by the god of the clay's capacity to preserve. And the deed of that god, the singular great act of the deity, who is constitutively related to the ability of writing to carry meaning into distant days, was specifically, deliberately, formally withheld from the clay. All the foundation bricks point to the moon. The moon held something back from the bricks, and when it finally came down, when it finally descended, in the time of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, what it came down as was not a tablet, not a clay cylinder, not a deed pressed into the walls of a ziggurat. What it came down as was a dream. In the night, during a dream, the moon came down, not in a way that Woolley could excavate, not in a way that ends up in a museum with accession numbers and condition notes and a shelf mark in the archive, not something you can hold in both hands and weigh. A dream. Undeposited, think about what this city was. Think about the city of Ur in 2100 BC, when Unamu was building the ziggurat and presiding over one of the most extraordinary concentrations of administrative, artistic, and religious energy in the ancient world. Think about the scribes in the Aduba, the tablet house, learning to press cuneiform signs into clay from the time they were children young enough to need a stool to reach the work table, spending years learning the hundreds of signs, the grammar, the lists, the liturgical formulas, the administrative conventions, before they were trusted with a real commission, their hands in clay every day. The smell of it, mineral and faintly cold, even when the courtyard outside was blazing at midday. Think about the high priestess in the Giparu, the great priestly residence, whose foundations Woolley found beneath the later construction phases, whose rooms were organised around the daily rituals that maintained Nana's presence in his earthly house. The appointments with the deity that had to be kept, the oil that had to be brought, the prayers that had to be said in the right sequence at the right time, because the sequence itself was what made the presence possible. Think about the people at the edge of the city whose work it was to watch the horizon at dusk and dawn and record where the moon appeared and disappeared relative to the edge of the world. The slow drift of the rising point over weeks and months, the gradual push northward, year by year, the incrementally earlier appearance above the horizon at its furthest reach, before the long recession back toward the centre began again, watching and recording across seasons and years and decades and generations, passing the records from one watcher to the next, building a measurement that no single human life was long enough to complete. All of that watching, all of that pressing, all of that recording and depositing and burying in walls, so that what was true would remain true across distant days. And somewhere in the sky above it, in the moon that all of this was directed toward, there was something that was not going into the clay. The city was calibrated to the moon's most extreme positions. The city was a measurement device for the 18.6-year cycle. The entire architectural program was organised around the moments when the moon touched the horizon at its maximum north and disappeared at its maximum south. The city was pointing, constantly, systematically, with the precision of people who had been watching and recording across multiple human lifetimes. The city was pointing at something that was not there. Or The city was pointing at something that was there, but was not being pointed at by any text. The quay that the moon god's boat docks at, the lapis lazuli landing place, the celestial blue stone that means this is where heaven touches earth. That quay is not a metaphor for a dock. It is the actual place in the Sumerian cosmological map where what comes from above makes contact with what is below, and the boat that arrives there carries something. The text will not say what. 5 goddesses could not stop it. The highest god received it, and what the last king of Babylon was told about it came down in a dream that he pressed into basalt. In a stela erected in a temple at Haran that he rebuilt after a century of ruin, on the authority of a god who announced that the most important thing he ever did was never written on clay. Nabonidus pressed it into stone instead. He could not press it into clay. He could not do the thing that his civilization had done, since before anyone living could remember press the meaningful thing into the clay and bury it in the wall so that it persisted. The deed that came down was not the kind of thing you could seal in a foundation cylinder and set at the corner of a ziggurat, so he put it in a stela, stone rather than clay, a different material, not the deposited kind, the erected kind, something you look at rather than something you stand on. And then Cyrus came, and then Babylon became Persian, and then Greek, and then Roman, and then the desert, and the stone of the Haran stela was found, broken in 2 fragments, in the early 20th century, and the cuneiform scholars read it, and the opening line is still waiting for someone to explain why the god of the clay's capacity to carry meaning into distant days chose, once for the most important thing he ever did, to hold it back from the clay entirely, to let it come down only as a dream, only as a thing whispered in the night to a man who had no dynasty, who had not expected to be king, who would spend 10 years walking between the cities of Arabia before he understood what he had been given. Here is where the record ends, not where the story ends. Records and stories are different things. The lament for Ur ends with a prayer that the moon god's city will be restored, that the quay will be active again, that the boats will come back. And the city was restored, rebuilt, reinscribed, reoccupied multiple times after its fall. The ziggurat that stands in the Iraqi desert today carries foundation inscriptions from Nabonidus alongside the earlier ones from Ur-Nammu. The last Babylonian king put his name on the earliest moon god's house. He found the old inscription inside the old walls, and he wrote his own name around it, in the way he had been trained to do, the way he did at every site he excavated. He was depositing himself into the record that the moon god had been keeping. He was adding his name to the bricks that said, "This place is made for Nannar. This agreement is sealed. This city belongs to the one who surpasses the Anunnaki gods, who is seated within their pure divine powers, who has been given as his inheritance that he should surpass them." And above the city, the moon would have been doing what it always does, tracking its 18.6-year cycle, rising at the northern standstill, disappearing at the southern one, going below for 3 dark days each month to adjudicate, coming back. The city of Ur had pointed at the moon for more than 1,500 years by the time Nabonidus arrived to add his inscriptions to the foundation bricks. The moon had been tracking the city for the same span of time. Think about what it means to have a relationship with something that outlasts you by that much. Not outlasts, you personally outlast the civilization that built the instrument for measuring it. Outlasts the scribal tradition that trained the watchers. Outlasts the political entity that organised the keeping of the records. The moon was there before Ornamu laid the first foundation brick, and the moon was there when Nabonidus pressed his name into the last one. And the moon made no inscription either time. It only moved. It only tracked its cycle. It only held, somewhere in that movement, whatever it was it had been holding since before Dilmun existed, before paradise, before the clean land, before the first water, before memory could reach. The city pointed. The moon kept moving. Neither one fully said what they were pointing at. And the last thing the record gives us, the last description of the deed before the record goes quiet, is the announcement that it arrived. Unwritten, undeposited, in the time of Nabonidus, in the night, in a dream. There is a question embedded in the lunar calendar that the ancient Mesopotamians lived by, and it is a question that the primary texts circle without landing on directly, the way you might circle a fire in the dark, getting close enough to feel the heat, never quite standing still at the centre. The question is this: where does the moon go? Not in the astronomical sense, not in the sense that we would answer it now, with orbital mechanics and the geometry of Earth's shadow and the mathematics of the synodic month. The Babylonian astronomical tradition was sophisticated enough by the first millennium BC to predict lunar eclipses with considerable accuracy. The Saros cycle, the 18-year periodicity that underlies eclipse prediction, was known to Babylonian astronomers and recorded in the astronomical diaries that are among the most extraordinary scientific documents of the ancient world. They knew the moon's motion with a precision that should not be underestimated. But that is not the question. The question is what happens during the 3 days when the moon is not in the sky. The 3 days of the dark moon, the period astronomers call the new moon phase, when the moon rises and sets with the sun and is entirely invisible from Earth. 3 days of darkness where the moon should be. 3 days of nothing in the space that the moon ordinarily occupies. The Sumerian and Babylonian texts address this with remarkable consistency across a wide range of genres. Incantation texts, hymns, lament literature, wisdom texts, all of them orient around the same understanding. During the dark days, the moon is below, not absent. Below, it has descended. It has gone into the underworld, the realm of the dead, the place beneath the earth where the great gods of that domain, Nergal and Ereshkigal, the king and queen of the deep, hold their own court. The moon goes down, and in the underworld, according to the logic that threads through these texts, the moon does what it does in the sky. It judges, it presides, it reviews. This is not a minor theological point. The moon god's periodic descent into the underworld is structurally parallel to Inanna's famous descent. The great myth of the goddess who goes below, passes through the 7 gates, is stripped of her divine attributes one by one, arrives at the throne of her sister Ereshkigal, is killed and hung on a hook, and is eventually resurrected through the intervention of Enki's wisdom. That myth turns on a single question: what authority can survive the stripping away of every attribute, every title, every garment, every power? Inanna's answer is the self that remains when everything else has been removed. The moon god's version of the descent is less dramatic in the mythological literature, but more persistent in the ritual calendar. Every month, not once in a story, but 12 times a year in practice, Nanna goes below. Every month the sky becomes dark for 3 days. Every month the judgment is conducted. and every month the moon comes back. This return, the reappearance of the thin crescent on the western horizon at dusk, the first sliver of light after 3 days of absence, was one of the most observed and celebrated events in the Mesopotamian calendar. The appearance of the new crescent determined the beginning of the month. Scribes and astronomers watched the western horizon specifically for it. The moment of its appearance was recorded. Its angular width was measured. Its position relative to the sun was noted. A report was sent. The reappearance mattered because it confirmed that the judgment was complete. The moon had been below. The moon had adjudicated whatever needed adjudicating in the deep. And now it had come back, carrying with it whatever verdicts had been handed down in the dark. Now set this beside the Haran Stella. The great deed of sin, not written, not deposited, not known by gods or people, withheld across all the span of distant days, this deed came down in the time of Nabonidus. It descended. The word the text uses for the deed's arrival is the same class of directional verb that describes descent, coming down from above, moving from the upper register of the cosmos to the lower. The deed descended, just as the moon descends for 3 dark days each month, just as the moon descends and conducts its judgment and comes back. But this descent was different. This was not the monthly ritual. This was the arrival of something that had not descended before. Not in all the time that the monthly descent had been happening, not in all the months, all the years, all the generations during which the scribes and the astronomers had been watching the western horizon for the returning crescent, had this particular thing come down. The moon had been going below for the judgment every month since before memory, and every month it had come back, and every time it had come back it had left something below, in the underworld, in the dark court where Nergal and Ereshkigal held their watch. Every month's return was also every month's retention, the thing not brought up, the verdict not published, the part of the judgment that stayed below. Over thousands of years of monthly descents and monthly returns, something accumulated. And in 556 BC, it came down for the first time into the land, into the dream of a man who had not expected to be king. The structure of this is worth sitting with for a long time, because it is not the structure of a revelation in the way revelation is usually presented in religious literature. It is not the burning bush, not the voice from the cloud, not the sudden blinding light on the road. Those are arrivals from outside the system interruptions. The deed of sin described in the Haran Stela is not an interruption. It is the culmination of a process that has been running for the entirety of Mesopotamian history and possibly longer. Every dark moon was a preparation. Every descent and return was a step in something. Every month that Nana went below and came back without releasing the deed was a month in which the deed was being held at a specific level of readiness, a specific degree of preparation that had not yet reached whatever threshold required for the descent into the land to happen. And then, in the time of Nabonidus, it had. The threshold was reached, the deed came down. What the threshold was, what changed, what was sufficient, what finally allowed the long preparation to complete the Haran Stela, does not say. It records the arrival. It does not explain the condition that made the arrival possible. But there is one piece of evidence that the text provides, almost incidentally, tucked inside the sequence of events it describes. Easy to pass over if you are reading for the main argument and not watching the edges. The condition that preceded the deed's descent was Adad-Gupi's death. She died before the temple was rebuilt. She died before her son completed the restoration that the dream had commanded. The inscription records this plainly. The renovations of the Ehul Hall were completed after her death, and the stela was erected posthumously to honour what her life service had made possible. She did not see the completion. She waited her whole life and died before the answer arrived in its final form. And the deed came down into her son's dream while she was still alive, but the deed's full enactment, the physical restoration of the house, the return of the offering rituals, the reactivation of the quay happened after she was gone. The woman who held the door open for a century did not walk through it. Her son walked through it. There is something in this that the Lament for had already said, in a different register, in a different century, before any of this happened. Ningal begged twice. The city was destroyed anyway. And the texts, not just the lament, but the broader tradition of Sumerian lament literature, record that the gods eventually returned to their cities, that Nana eventually came back to that the quay became active again, that the boats docked again, that the rituals resumed. The destruction was real, the abandonment was real, and the return was also real. The pattern runs through the entire textual tradition. Absence, then return. Dark days, then crescent. Destroyed quay, then active quay. Temple in ruins for a century, then temple restored. The moon keeps coming back. It just does not always bring everything with it when it returns. The Babylonian astronomical diaries are among the most extraordinary documents in the history of science. They are not well known outside the specialist literature. They do not appear in popular treatments of ancient Mesopotamia with anywhere near the frequency they deserve. They sit in the collections of the British Museum and in scholarly databases and in the critical editions prepared by Abraham Sachs and Hermann Hunger in the late 20th century. And they record with systematic regularity, spanning several centuries, the nightly positions of the moon, the planets, the weather, commodity prices, and notable events in Babylon. The earliest confirmed diary fragments date to approximately 652 BCC, though scholars believe the practice of systematic nightly recording began earlier. The latest datable entries come from the Seleucid period, well into the 3rd century BC. The tradition of watching, recording, and preserving these observations ran continuously for at least 4 centuries and possibly more. Think about what that means in institutional terms. Not what it means astronomically, though it means a great deal astronomically, but what it means as a human project. Someone had to be watching every clear night. Someone had to be recording every observation in the standard format. Someone had to be curating the accumulating archive, ensuring that the records from previous generations were preserved and accessible to the current generation of observers. Someone had to be training the next generation to watch correctly, to record correctly, to read the accumulated observations correctly. This is a civilization that decided at some point that the sky was worth watching every night for as long as the civilization existed. And what they were watching, above all else, was the moon, not the planets, though the planets were tracked with great care, and the Babylonian planetary theories are sophisticated enough to have occupied historians of science for decades. Not the stars, though the star catalogues and the Zikpu star lists and the rising and setting times of fixed stars are documented in the astronomical literature with considerable thoroughness. The moon's daily position, the moon's monthly cycle, the moon's relationship to the ecliptic, the path of the sun through the sky, the moon's relationship to the planets, it passed conjunctions, occultations, the moments when the moon passed in front of a bright planet and the planet briefly disappeared, the timing of the moon's rising and setting, the angular diameter of the lunar disk, the colour of the moon at rising, the presence or absence of a halo, every night that was clear enough to see, recorded, archived, passed forward. Now here is the part that connects to everything else in this documentary. The Babylonian astronomers, the people maintaining this multi-century observation program, worked inside a religious institutional framework. The astronomical diaries were kept by the temple personnel of Babylon. The observers and recorders were not secular scientists in the modern sense. They were priests, or at minimum scholars operating within a priestly institutional context. The knowledge they were producing was understood by them and by the society that supported them as a form of divine service. They were watching the moon because the moon was a god, and the god's movements through the sky were the god's communications to the world below. This is not naive. This is not primitive. This is a different epistemic framework, a different understanding of what knowledge is for and where it comes from, and it produced results that are genuinely impressive by any standard of evaluation. The Babylonian prediction of lunar eclipses, based entirely on the long accumulation of observed patterns, was accurate enough to be useful. The synodic month, the average period from new moon to new moon, was calculated to a precision that differs from the modern value by less than 1 second per month. The 18-year Saros cycle was known. The anomalistic month, the draconitic month, the distinctions between different ways of measuring the moon's period were all part of the working astronomical vocabulary, and all of this was done in service of a theological project. The project was understanding what the moon god was saying. Now set this beside the Haran Stella's opening lines. The great deed of sin, not known by any of the gods, not descended from heaven into the land since distant days, not seen by the people of the land, not written down on a clay tablet, not deposited for eternity. The people doing the watching, the astronomers and priests and observers at the top of the ziggurat and at the observation platforms and in the tablet houses of Babylon, these people were as close to the moon god's communications as anyone in the ancient world had ever been. They had centuries of accumulated observation. They had predictive models. They had the ability to calculate where the moon would be before it got there. And still, the great deed was unknown to them. Not because they were not watching, because what they were watching was not the deed. The deed was not in the nightly position of the moon. The deed was not in the relationship between the moon and the ecliptic. The deed was not in the eclipse prediction, or the synodic period calculation, or the lunar halo, or the colour of the moon at rising. The deed was being held somewhere the instruments could not reach. All that watching, all those centuries of nightly observation, all that careful recording and archiving and training and passing forward. And the most important thing the moon god ever did was not in any of it. The sky that the astronomers were reading was the public face of a god whose most significant act was being conducted in private. Consider what this implies about the relationship between what can be observed and what is actually happening. The Babylonian astronomical project was, by any reasonable measure, the most sustained and systematic program of empirical observation that the ancient world produced. Its practitioners were not guessing. They were not relying on myth or tradition alone. They were watching, measuring, recording, checking their predictions against their observations, adjusting their models when the predictions failed. And the thing they most needed to know was not available to observation. It was not in the sky they were reading, it was in the part of the sky, or the part of whatever the sky is, the surface of that does not show. The underside. The hidden face. The 3 dark days every month, when the moon was below and the sky was empty, and whatever the god was doing down there in the court of Nergal and Ereshkigal, was not something that any instrument, any observer, any archive could record. The deed lived in the dark days. And it came down in a dream. Dreams in the ancient Mesopotamian world were not understood the way we tend to understand them now. We have inherited several centuries of secular interpretation that have pushed dreams into the territory of psychology, into the private interior of the individual mind, into the realm of processed experience and unconscious processing and neurological activity during sleep, even when people in the modern world treat dreams as meaningful. The meaning is typically understood as a meaning about the dreamer. The dream reflects your anxieties. The dream processes your recent experiences. The dream reveals something about your inner state. The ancient Mesopotamian understanding was almost precisely the opposite. In the Mesopotamian framework, the dream was a space of contact, not a reflection of the interior of the dreamer, but a transmission from outside. The dreamer was not generating the dreamer was receiving it. The dream was a medium, a specific kind of altered state that created the conditions under which a divine being could deliver a communication that would not be possible through ordinary sensory channels. This is documented extensively in the primary literature. The Gilgamesh epic, the most famous narrative text from ancient Mesopotamia, turns on a series of dreams that function as predictive transmissions. Enkidu dreams his own death before it happens. Gilgamesh dreams the arrival of Enkidu before they meet. The dreams are not interpreted as psychological states, they are interpreted as messages, and the interpretive task is to correctly decode the transmission, not to understand the dreamer better. The royal inscriptions use dreams in a specific way that is slightly different from the narrative literature. In royal inscriptions and the Haran Stela is a royal inscription. The dream is almost always a commissioning. The god appears, the god delivers a command, the king is obligated by the delivery. The dream creates a binding. It is not advisory, it is not symbolic. It is a direct divine to royal communication of the kind that, in the waking world, would require the king to prostrate himself before the god's statue in the temple. In the dream, the god and the king are in the same space. The intermediary apparatus, the temple, the statue, the priesthood, the ritual protocol is bypassed. The god speaks directly. This is why the Haran Stela's structure makes sense in a way that might not be immediately obvious. The deed of sin that was never written and never deposited arrived through the one channel that bypasses the writing and the depositing, not through a temple ritual, not through a priestly intermediary, not through the systematic observation of the moon's movements by the astronomers at the top of the ziggurat, through a dream. The one form of divine communication that cannot be archived, cannot be deposited in a foundation cylinder, cannot be pressed into clay and buried in a wall. You cannot excavate a dream. Woolley could not have found it. It would not be in the Penn Museum. There is no museum object number for a dream. There is no accession record. There is no condition note. There is no shelf mark. The deed arrived through the only channel that shares the deed's defining quality. It is real. it happened, it had effects in the world, and it is not in the clay. Now consider what Nabonidus did with it. He pressed it into basalt, not clay. Stone, the stela at Haran, is not a clay tablet. It is not a foundation brick. It is an erected monument, a stela, a standing stone, a form of inscription that functions differently from a buried deposit. A deposit is sealed inside a wall and communicates forward in time through its persistence inside the structure. A stela stands in a public space and communicates laterally to people in the present, in the place where it stands, who can see it and read it and understand what it says. A deposit speaks to the future. A stela speaks to the present. Nabonidus erected a stela. He did not deposit the deed, he displayed it. He made it visible in the place where it arrived the temple of Sin at Haran, rather than sealing it into the foundations of the building. He chose the form of inscription that cannot be hidden, cannot be buried, cannot be sealed into the structure, so that it persists into distant days without anyone knowing it is there. He chose the visible form. And then the stela was broken, and then it was buried in the rubble of successive destructions at the site, and then it was found in fragments in the early 20th century and taken to the museum in Istanbul, where it sits now. The form that Nabonidus chose to make the deed visible, to give it the lateral, present tense communication that a stela provides rather than the forward. Future tense persistence of a deposit ended up in the ground anyway, not as a deposit, as debris. And when the cuneiform scholars read it, it spoke again, not to Nabonidus's present, to ours. The deed that was never written, never deposited, never known by gods or people, across all the span of distant days, arrived in a dream, was pressed into stone, was buried in rubble, was found in fragments, was read by scholars, and is now being spoken aloud in a documentary that you are listening to while the night comes in around wherever you are right now. The transmission is still running. It did not stop in 539 BC when Cyrus marched into Babylon. It did not stop when the Haran temple was destroyed again. It did not stop when the fragments were lifted out of the soil and carried to Istanbul. Each time the text surfaces into legibility, the announcement renews itself. The great deed of sin, not written on a clay tablet, not deposited for eternity, and yet here it is, surfacing again, in your time, in a form that the king who pressed it into stone could not have imagined. The dream keeps descending. There is a specific intellectual move that the Haran stela makes, and that most readings of the document fail to credit. The stela does not merely announce that a deed existed and was withheld. It describes the shape of the withholding with enough precision that the shape itself becomes a kind of information. 5 qualities: unknown, undescended, unseen, unwritten, undeposited. Each of these is a different kind of absence, and they are not synonymous. They describe, in sequence, a progression from the widest possible scale of concealment down to the most specific. Unknown, this is the largest category. The deed was not known. Not by gods, not by goddesses, not by the divine assembly, not by the beings who collectively know everything there is to know in the Sumerian cosmological framework. The deed was outside the totality of divine knowledge. This is an extraordinary claim. In the Sumerian theological universe, the gods know things that humans do not. The me are held by the gods before they are distributed to humans. The fates of cities are decreed by the divine assembly before they are enacted in history. The gods operate from a position of knowledge, that is, categorically superior to human knowledge. And the text says this deed was unknown to all of them. This means the deed was not merely hidden from humans, it was hidden from the entire order of being that includes the gods. The concealment was not a god keeping something from mortals, it was something prior to the god mortal distinction altogether, something held back from the entire structure of existence as the Sumerians understood it. Undescended this is more specific, not merely unknown, but spatially undelivered. The deed existed somewhere above in the heavenly register, in the realm from which the gods and their powers and their communications originate, and it had not come down, not in all the time since distant days, not in all the months of the lunar cycle, not in all the astronomical observations, not in any of the forms in which the divine world communicates with the terrestrial world. The deed had a location. It was above, and it had stayed above, unseen, more specific still. The progression is tightening. Even if something is unknown and undelivered, it might still be perceivable through some other channel, through vision, through direct experience, through encounter. But this deed had not been seen. Not by anyone, not by the people of the land. This is a different kind of absence from the first two. Unknown removes the deed from the category of knowledge. Undescended removes it from the category of delivered things. Unseen removes it from the category of experienced things. A thing can be unknown and still be somehow encountered. This deed had not even been encountered without being understood. It had not crossed into any human experience at all. Unwritten now, the tightening becomes specifically Mesopotamian. Not merely unseen in general, but unseen in the particular way that the Mesopotamian civilization processed and preserved experience through writing. Even if something was experienced but not fully understood, a scribe might write it down as an observation, a notation, an anomaly in the record. But this deed had not reached the level of notation. It was not in the archive. It was not in the astronomical diaries. It was not in the incantation texts. It was not in the hymn literature. It had left no trace in the most comprehensive archiving system the ancient world had yet produced. Undeposited, and this is the final tightening, the most precise specification in the sequence. Not merely unwritten in the general sense, but undeposited in the formal, ritual, legally binding sense. Not placed into the record in the manner that confers permanence. Not sealed into walls. Not pressed into corners of buildings. Not buried at thresholds. Not committed to the clay in the way that creates the specific kind of survival that the foundation deposit tradition was designed to create. These 5 qualities are not redundant. They are concentric rings of absence, each one more precisely defined than the last, each one eliminating a different possible mode of access until what remains is the absolute specificity of what was being withheld. Something that existed outside divine knowledge had remained in the upper register, had never been encountered by any human, had left no trace in the archival record, and had not been formally committed to permanence through the ritual technologies of written deposit. And then it descended into a dream in the time of Nabonidus. Notice what this means for the 5 qualities. The deed is now known, Nabonidus knows it. It has descended, it has moved from the upper register to the human world. It has been seen not with open eyes, but in the interior vision of the dream, which is the form of seeing that the Mesopotamian framework treats as more reliable than waking sight for divine communication. It has been written, Nabonidus pressed it into the stela. And it has been well. Has it been deposited? The stela was erected, not buried. It was displayed, not sealed. And yet it ended up in the ground. It was found in pieces, having been covered over by subsequent construction and destruction, lying in the soil like a foundation deposit that was never intended to be one, as if the deed, having spent all of distant days outside the category of deposited things, arrived at deposition anyway, not through intention, but through time. Not through the formal ritual of pressing clay into a corner and burying it, but through the slow accumulation of rubble over a standing stone that had been broken. The universe, apparently, deposits everything eventually, even the things that were specifically withheld from deposit, even the great deed of sin. The 5 negatives that open the Haran Stela are not just a description of what had not happened, they are a description of what would happen. They are the shape of a future that the deed was moving toward across all of distant days, the future in which finally all 5 qualities would be reversed. Known, descended, seen, written, deposited, Nabonidus reversed the first 4. Time reversed the 5th. And now you are listening to it. There is a thread that the record hands to us and then pulls back before we can follow it all the way. Nabonidus came back from 10 years in the Arabian desert. He rebuilt the temple at Haran. He restored the A-Hall and dedicated it with the full ritual apparatus of the Babylonian royal consecration ceremony. He instituted the worship of sin across his empire in a way that generated significant friction with the Marduk priesthood in Babylon, the priesthood of the city's primary deity, who did not appreciate the elevation of a competing cult to imperial status. And then in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia marched into Babylon. The ancient sources conflict about what happened next. The verse account of Nabonidus, a Babylonian text written from a perspective hostile to Nabonidus, probably produced after the Persian conquest and possibly at Persian instigation, portrays him as impious, negligent, and deserving of the defeat that removed him. The Cyrus Cylinder, the famous Persian propaganda text in which Cyrus presents himself as the chosen of Marduk, frames the conquest as a religious liberation. Marduk had abandoned Babylon because of Nabonidus' impiety and had invited Cyrus in. Even the Greek sources, writing centuries later, contribute their own distortions. What the sources do not clearly resolve is what happened to Nabonidus himself. Some ancient accounts suggest he was killed. Others suggest he was exiled, sent to Carmania, a region in what is now southern Iran, where he lived out his remaining years in comfortable but definitive removal from power. The Babylonian king lists go quiet at this point in a way that frustrates any effort to determine his fate with confidence. But there is one more document. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, the remarkable cache of texts discovered in the Judean desert in 1947 and the years following, in the caves above the ruins of the Essene community there is a fragmentary Aramaic text catalogued as 4Q242. Scholars call it the Prayer of Nabonidus. It is 4 fragments. It is damaged. The reconstruction is uncertain in places, but the text it preserves describes a king of Babylon who was afflicted with a severe illness, a skin disease, for 7 years while living at Tamar. While in Tamar, he is healed by a Jewish exorcist or diviner who interprets his illness as the result of his own sin and calls him to repentance and right worship. Tamar, the same city that appears in the Haran Stela's list of cities Nabonidus walked between during his 10 desert years, the city where German archaeologists found inscriptions in his name, the city that appears on the Arabian route the road between Babylon and the cities of the Hejaz. The scholarly debate about this text is ongoing and complex. Some scholars read the prayer of Nabonidus as an authentic memory of a real event in Nabonidus's life, preserved in the Aramaic tradition through channels now difficult to reconstruct. Others argue that it is a variant tradition about Nebuchadnezzar II, the more famous Babylonian king that has become attached to Nabonidus through confusion or deliberate reattribution. The parallel with the story of Nebuchadnezzar's madness in the book of Daniel is close enough that the relationship between the two traditions has been a topic of serious scholarly discussion since the Qumran texts were first analysed. But set the scholarly debate aside for a moment. Not to ignore it, the debate is real and important. Set it aside just long enough to notice what the document, if it preserves any authentic memory of Nabonidus, is describing. A king who walked in the desert and was ill, and was spoken to by a figure from outside his own tradition, and was offered an interpretation of his suffering that he had not been able to reach on his own. A man in the desert looking for what was withheld from him. The Haran Stela ends with Nabonidus receiving the deed and being sent to walk the roads of Arabia. The prayer of Nabonidus, if it is about the same man, finds him in one of those Arabian cities, sick, and being given something by a stranger. The transmission that began with Adad-Gupi keeping the lamp lit in the ruined temple at Haran, the transmission that passed through the dream. Through the 10 desert years, through the restoration of the Ehulhul, through the fall of Babylon to Cyrus, this transmission does not stop cleanly at 539 BCE. It continues into a fragmentary Aramaic document found in a cave above the Dead Sea 2,500 years after the events it describes. And then it passes into the tradition that produced the Book of Daniel, where a king loses his reason and wanders in the wilderness and is restored. And then into the Sibylline tradition, which preserves echoes of Babylonian royal theology in Greek prophetic literature. And then into the Arab historical tradition, which has its own memory of Nabonidus and Tamar, preserved in sources that medieval Islamic scholars worked with and that modern archaeologists have begun to check against the physical evidence emerging from the Arabian sites. The deed keeps transmitting. It never arrived as a deposit. It never settled into the clay with the finality of a foundation brick sealed inside a wall. It kept moving. It kept appearing in new forms, in new languages, in new traditions, each transmission slightly different from the last, each one carrying something of the original shape, the 5 negatives, the unknown deed, the thing that was being prepared across all the distant days and losing something else. This is what unharvested things do. Things that are never fully deposited keep circulating. They cannot be archived. They cannot be catalogued. They cannot be given a museum accession number and a shelf location and a condition note. They persist differently from deposited things, more diffusely, more unpredictably, in texts that do not expect to be carrying them. The Haran Stela announced that the deed had arrived. Nabonidus pressed the announcement into stone. The stone was broken and buried and found in pieces and carried to Istanbul and read by scholars. But the deed itself, the specific content, the 5 times negated thing that was held back from divine knowledge and from the land and from human sight and from the archive and from the permanent deposit for all the span of distant days, the deed itself was never in the stone. The stone announced it. The deed remained, as it had always been, prior to the stone, prior to the clay, prior to the writing, prior to the depositing. somewhere in the part of the sky, or the part of whatever the sky is, the surface of that does not show. In the 3 dark days, in the judgment conducted below, in the part of the moon that always faces away from the earth, the part that no human on the ground had ever seen from the cities of Ur and Nippur and Haran, the part that was always turned toward something else, toward whatever is on the other side of the moon from the world that was watching. The city pointed at the moon. The moon carried its face turned partially away. And somewhere in the facing away, in the part of the moon that the lapis lazuli quae could not see, that the foundation bricks could not record, that the astronomical diaries could not observe, that the dreaming king could receive only as an announcement rather than as the full content of the thing announced, the deed remained. As it remains now, not because it was lost, not because no one was watching carefully enough, not because the record-keeping failed, or the tradition broke, or the transmission was interrupted, but because some things are constitutively prior to the systems we build to hold them. The city of Ur was one of the most sophisticated information management systems the ancient world produced. The scribal tradition, the foundation deposit practice, the astronomical observation program, the administrative archive, the hymn literature, the lament literature, all of it, was the civilization's attempt to hold what it knew in a form that would persist into distant days. And the moon, which was the reason all of it existed, held the most important thing it knew outside the system entirely. Not as a failure of the system, not as a secret being kept maliciously from the people who built their city to face it, as a reminder of what systems are for. They are for holding what can be held. Not everything can be held, and the things that cannot be held are not thereby lost. They continue to move. They continue to track their cycle. They continue to descend and adjudicate and return every month, carrying whatever they carry from below. The crescent reappears on the western horizon. The scribes and the astronomers and the priests and the dreamers look up. They record the width of the crescent, its position, its colour, the hour of its appearance. They note that the moon has come back. They do not note what was retained below, only that it came back without it, only that the deed, this time, remained where it always was, somewhere prior to the clay, somewhere in the part of the sky that is still dark.